this is Deborah Selwood for the Photographer Academy, and today we'll be talking about considerations when building a studio. And this is my studio. So we've renovated an old lace mill. You can probably tell by the structural beams that it's quite a substantial building, and it's got a lot of height, which for me, for my business, is ideal. Shooting fashion, not so much for the shooting beauty, but certainly shooting fashion and fashion designers. As soon as you get to the low angles, you need the height. So to have the backgrounds suspended so high is ideal for the type of work that I do. So it's an ideal working space for me. It's big enough for me to have people like a team in with me, but also I can keep this. It's a nice sort of close environment for us to work together, and it feels quite intimate. It's nice to be able to work with the team in the room because you can keep that synergy going and keep the rapport going throughout the day, rather than the team working in a different room and then just coming into the shoot. You've already built that relationship. So, you know, for me, it's ideal. I hadn't planned that. I'd planned to have a separate makeup room, but that didn't work so well. It made it a lot more cold and a lot more clinical. By the time they come in, you then have to warm up and get to know each other. Whereas this, you've got to know each other pretty well by the time you start shooting, which is ideal. So I've painted my walls in, I think it's dove grey. So it's a fairly neutral grey. I didn't want to go for white because the type of work that I do, I don't want light bouncing everywhere. So I wanted to go for a grey. I suppose ideally I could have gone for black, but it would have looked a bit grim. So this was a compromise to go for a nice grey. And also I use this wall as a shooting wall quite a lot, so I actually shoot on that grey wall, and it just saves me on grey paper, which is great for everybody, really. Depending on what I'm doing, I tend to use the poly boards, and they are just a polystyrene board, which I bought from DIY Place, I guess. I don't think it was B&Q, but somewhere similar to that. And then just a matte paint, but you have to be careful. I think it has to be a water-based paint, because otherwise oil, it starts to melt. So obviously, it's a cheap way of doing it, of creating, if you've got a smaller studio, or if you've got white walls, or something that you want to control the light, that gives you the control. And obviously if you turn it the reverse way on the white side, you then got a giant reflector. So they're great, they're quite big, but very useful. If you had a smaller space, you could probably use black cloth. You might want to put a curtain across, and then you can just draw it back. So again, you'd be able to kill the light, take the light out. And again, where I used to work, the studio prior to this had a really low ceiling. So it was impossible for fashion work, for anything shooting full length. I just didn't have the height. So when we moved here, one of the main considerations for me was just to have that shooting height, to be able to shoot from the low angle, to extend and really show off the length of the model and show the clothing to the best advantage, rather than what I was having to do at the last studio was shoot from here, and not be able to, and sort of shoot from almost their height or just slightly lower, but anything more than that, I was losing the background just because I didn't have the height. So this is ideal, really, for the type of work. But it depends what you're doing. If you're shooting more family shots, you wouldn't need that height. You wouldn't want to be shooting up somebody's nose, as it were, if you were shooting with families. But for fashion, you just want to extend and make people look as long and lean as possible. We have, well, beautiful windows here. With it being an old lace mill, they tend to have the really big windows. I personally, as yet, have not used the window light, but I can see that it's something that I will develop this year, and it's something that I'll definitely look into. I've been researching on the internet using larger windows for light, so that's something that I definitely want to try. The light quality is lovely, but obviously at the moment I've got sort of certain directions that I can use, but yeah, definitely something to try. I've got blackout blinds on all of my windows just so I can really take the light out and get as less spill of light in. The design of the windows isn't ideal at the moment. This is something that I'll look at changing, but it's, as with any studio, you set off and you think something's going to work and it doesn't quite work. But in the main, it works fine, because obviously there's a tiny little spill at the top, which we can cover if necessary. I do shoot with UV, and when I'm shooting with UV, everything has to be completely blackout, because you're shooting at longer time spans, so obviously any ambient light is going to show. Most of the time the blackout blinds are really sufficient. If I shot the way that I've set my camera up, which is usually ISO 100, 1/25 of a second at f8 or round about there, there wouldn't be any spill whatsoever using those blinds. They're really sufficient for my needs. Moving further into the studio, we built the studio with training in mind, so I've got space to have quite a few people either sitting, or we looked at the possibility of doing retouching training here as well, so we could set out with desks, and yeah, it's just a good space. We wanted to make sure that I didn't outgrow it. The last studio that I was in, I outgrew very, very quickly. And sometimes you just want a little bit of extra length to use one of your longer lenses. With a smaller studio, you wouldn't have that option. And you don't want to be distorting features if you're shooting and having to shoot on a wide angle. So I needed the studio to be so long in order to be able to shoot the kind of things that I want to shoot. But that was a learning curve with the previous studio and the problems with the previous studio. So this kind of gives me a lot more space than I need, but I'm not going to grow out of it. We also use the studio when I have shoots with makeup artists or hairstylists. We use this side of the studio for them to prepare. Within the next couple of weeks, there are a load of mirrors going up on this side, so they'll be going up on this wall, just so it's easier for the hairstylists, obviously working on the hair, to be able to see the front of the hair while they're working on the back. At the moment, it's a little bit of a work in progress, but you know, I can see what needs to happen with it. Also, I don't like to really shoot on white backgrounds. I tend to shoot any other colour but white. So I've got a lot of backgrounds. I've got those stored at the back, and they're out of the way enough, but they're easily accessible to change over. So, you know, that's ideal for me. And what I have found, the previous studio was quite cold and quite a damp studio, and with paper it sometimes ripples. So I found that if I store them flat like that, they ripple less, and I've not had any problems here. So you could store them upright, but I found that they kind of rippled, and then you ruined a paper roll, so it's not really ideal. So that was my fix to make sure that I could keep my paper backgrounds in good shape. Obviously, when building a studio, you never really get everything right first time, because you think you know what you need, and then as you're working in the space, things develop, or you realise that there are other things that you do need. One of the examples for me is I still don't have enough power, so we'll be putting a little bit more extra power, because I don't want to be running off extension cables. I want to make sure that I've got sufficient power to use all my lights. There are some over that side which we use for other things, but they're not quite so useful. One of the things that I didn't want was to trail a wire from the wall into the centre of the studio, and nor did I want a box on the floor, because I'm quite clumsy and I would trip over it, and if I can trip over it, so can everybody else. Instead of having a trailing wire this way, we've got a wire suspended, so we've got power points here for the main light, and another one here which is predominantly for hair lights, just so we haven't got those trip hazards in the studio. One of the things that I'm looking into is a sort of pull down system, so when I'm not using it, it's not hanging around in the studio, because obviously when it's in, I don't want to be getting a ladder to take it down. So that would be the great idea, and that's what will happen long term. As this space develops, we're also looking at putting a glide system in, just so everything's out of the way and we don't have the trip hazards. And also I have freedom to move my lights, because I do tend to move my lights around a lot when I'm shooting. When I originally designed the studio, we were looking at putting an infinity cove in that side, so at the far end of the studio, and my makeup room is next door. The idea originally was to have the makeup room separate, but obviously in terms of everybody getting to know one another, it's better for us to be together. If I'd put a door in that far end, that would have been a lot easier, and then that you'd still have that sort of openness to be able to communicate. But at the time, I thought that it was best to get the cove in that side and have my other shooting area this side, when in fact what we're probably going to do, we've got the cove now, is to put a studio in downstairs, as more as a rental studio, but for the type of stuff that I do, because I don't use a cove a vast amount, but it is something that I'd use for dancers, just so they're not slipping on paper, because the worst thing is to injure someone when they're coming into the studio. So ideally, that's going to be downstairs, so that's one of the next builds in progress in the building. Working with the colleges, I tend to use quite a lot of fabric backgrounds, just so we've got some custom backgrounds that are easy to carry, easy to get to and from the college, and they need somewhere to store. So having a system like this, where it's quite long enough to store pretty much any fabric, it just gives me that ease. And what I particularly love about this system is the fact that I can wheel this to and from. It just makes, because this stuff's heavy, you know, it's nice to be able to wheel it about freely, and also it keeps everything together. So I know that all my stands are here, I keep my lights here, and then when I'm ready to go to the colleges, I can just grab everything in one go. So it's just ideal. I would certainly recommend this as a great system if you're storing reasonable amount, and obviously mixed things, so not just photography equipment but other things like fabrics. I do make a lot of custom backgrounds, so there's other types of materials on here, so it just gives me that freedom to have a lot of things stored and not the weight of having to carry everything. I can just wheel it. So it's a brilliant system. So hopefully that's been of use to you. Thanks for watching. I'm Deborah Selwood for the Photographer Academy.